Chapter 10. Jim started the return trip to his home camp in the morning. With a stop at each trap along the line, it was impossible to make much speed, but he covered the 17 miles to the cabin at Long Portage before nightfall. A single ermine was all he found in the traps. Not a profitable day of work. It was not quite so cold that night, and he slept comfortably in the lean-to, with a good fire in front of the entrance. 4 or 5 hours of travel the next day brought him in sight of the upper camp. The slant sunlight of the afternoon fell gently on the snowy roof, but Jim's ears told him that all was not as peaceful as it looked. There was a great squalling of jays and a chattering of squirrels from the sheltered side of the cabin where he had his moose meat hung. He shoveled the snow away from the door with a snowshoe and ran inside and got his shotgun. When he came around the corner of the camp, the battle was still in progress. 4 or 5 red squirrels were tearing at the frozen meat, while a flock of Canadian jays squawked and fluttered and tried to drive them away. Jim lifted the gun and fired both barrels in quick succession. The hail of shot cut through the middle of the melee, scattering the combatants in all directions. As the echoes of the double report died away, a sudden silence fell. Jim picked up the bodies of a half-dozen jays and 2 squirrels and tossed them to the dogs. Then he went to examine the meat. In spite of the fact it was frozen to a rock-like hardness, the thieves had destroyed almost 2/3 of the flesh. The boy looked at it with glum discouragement. Losing provisions was a serious matter back in the bush. He was counted on that quarter of meat to last him through till Christmas, and thinking of Christmas, he wondered just how long it would be until holiday. In the cabin, he had a stick with notches cut for days. Then he went in, and with the help of his diary, tried to bring the calendar up to date. As nearly as he could figure, it was the 23rd of November. When he saw Lindsay, he'd be able to check up. Turning to the preparation of supper, Jim found another minor calamity had come to his food supply. Some small animal had crawled through a chink in the logs and gnawed a hole in the grub box. More than a cupful of flour was scattered on the dirt floor. Wood mice must have done the damage. He plugged the hole as best he could with a peg of hardwood and found a big tin can in which to place the flour bag. The life of a trapper, he told himself sadly, was not all roses. A grey light was beginning to steal into the cabin next morning when Jim arose and peered over the edge of his eiderdown. Something beside the light had wakened him, a sound like a tiny high-pitched shriek. He rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and looked across the corner to the opposite side of the hut. There was a slender bit of white fur over there in the semi-darkness, and 2 beady black eyes stared at him. A weasel. Jim lifted himself slowly and carefully on one elbow. As his vision cleared, he could see a small body under the weasel's forepaws. "Good boy," breathed the youngster with a grin. "Fixed that low-down mouse that ate my flour, didn't you?" He sat perfectly still and watching. After a few seconds, the ermine sank its teeth into the victim's throat, drank the blood, then turned and vanished silently. There was a savage efficiency in its technique that made the boy shiver. He remembered a saying of his father's, that if a weasel were as big as coyotes, no man would ever be safe in the woods. Yet he couldn't help admire the sheer ferocity, daring of the tiny killer. When he had dressed and built the fire, he spent 10 minutes hunting for a hole by which the weasel and its prey had entered. Apparently the walls were solid. At last he gave up the search and got breakfast. There was plenty of chores to occupy Jim around the camp that morning. He melted a big bucket full of snow water and washed his clothes, hanging them to dry in the rack above the stove. Then he put a batch of bread in the oven to bake and went out with his axe to get in a supply of wood. About noon he dragged a big log butt back to the cabin when the dog set up a ferocious barking. Looking out across the river, he saw a squat short figure breaking trail for 3 gaunt huskies and a battered old toboggan. The man was coming down from the direction of Squaw Lake, slogging along with bent knees, his mittened hands hanging low. At Jim's trail he paused and swung in towards camp. Jim dropped his log by the woodpile and went down to the bank to meet his visitor. It was the Cree Indian, Joe Leek. The man pulled off his snowshoes and thrust them, toes up, into the snow in front of the sled dog. It was equivalent to an order to the team to stay where they were. Then he raised a hand in silent greeting and came up the path. "How are you, Joe?" asked Jim. He had no tobacco to offer his guest, so he went into the cabin and took the kettle of hot water off the stove and sprinkled a little tea in a pan to set it to brew and motioned the Indian to a bench. As soon as the tea was ready, he poured it in a tin cup and placed it on the table with a can of sugar. Joe Leek measured out half a teaspoon of the precious sweetening and stirred the tea vigorously. When he gulped down a swallow or two, he offered the cup to Jim. "You catch 'em fur? Plenty good, huh?" he inquired politely. "Fair. Nothing special. How are you making out?" said Jim. "Plenty of fisher. Nobody catch 'em fisher like Joe Leek," the Indian replied. There was no more remarks for a time. The Cree sipped noisily at the tea. When it was gone, he stood up and reached a hand into his breeches pocket. He came out holding a dirty stub of lead pencil. "Boy, take 'em," Joe explained. "Me bring 'em back." He laid the pencil carefully on the table and walked out. "Well, I'll be," Jim muttered under his breath. "Say, Joe, thanks a heap. I sure do appreciate it." He went after him down the trail and saw him stoop by the sled to pull back the canvas cover. Out came a pair of new moose-hide moccasins. The Indian said nothing, but pushed them into Jim's hand. Then he slipped his feet into the snowshoe straps and barked a guttural command to the dogs and led his team away, upriver. The boy was so surprised he could scarcely shout his thanks after the departing sled. When the Indian was out of sight, he carried the moccasins into the cabin, admiring their skillful workmanship. Then he went back to his wood chopping. Every time he thought of the Cree's 30-mile journey to return a 2-bit pencil, he shook his head and chuckled. It was typical of the honesty that made all white men of the North respect a woods Indian. And yet he had read in books and heard tenderfoot sportsmen remark that the redskin was no better than a thieving crook. The gift of moccasin was Joe Leek's way of expressing his gratitude for the dose of medicine they had given the boy. Without being told, Jim knew his mother must have received some similar present. By bedtime, his clothes on the bed frame over the stove were well dried. The bread he had baked came out of the oven crisp and brown. In the morning, he'd be ready to take the trail again. Bruno and Pat were thoroughly rested and eager to be off when he buckled on their harnesses shortly after sunrise. They mushed across country to Whitefish Lake and followed the trap line across its shore. A mile or so beyond, on the trail of Poplar Lake, Jim had a number 3 trap set in a fox path. It was 100 yards from the main track, so he left his dog and took his rifle and went in alone. As he neared the place, he saw something move beyond a low thicket. A great round head with tufted ears and glaring yellow eyes lifted to stare at him. "Lynx," he thought instantly, and leveled the rifle. But in the second when his front rifle came on the head, he knew it wasn't a lynx. The yellow eyes blinked at him solemnly. Instead of a snarling cat nose, he saw a short, hooked beak. The trap held a horned owl. Jim killed the bird and spread it out on the snow. It was the first time he had seen one of the species so close. The body, from ear tuft to tail, was nearly 2 feet long, and the wingspan between 5 and 6 feet. He began to understand when he saw the huge feathered talons how these big owls could wreak such havoc among the smaller woods animal. There was no fur in the trap around Porcupine Lake, and by the time Jim had tended them all, it was too late to go further that afternoon. He made himself and the dogs comfortable at the lean-to on the west shore and spent the night there. The next 2 days were uneventful. They traveled down Porcupine River to the camp Jim had built and explored the country below for several miles. It was low, desolate country without much sign of game or fur. Dead trees rose and bearded out the endless muskeg. A few otter trails were visible along the stream courses, but the boy saw only one mink track and no fisher. The sky clouded over and the air grew heavy. It felt like a storm. A few inches of snow fell in the night and the morning broke clear and cold. Jim was glad to turn his back on the barren muskeg and break trail up the river again. In the traps below Porcupine Lake he found 2 snowshoe rabbits, worthless as fur but a welcome change of diet for the dogs. They ate them, hide and all. "That'll grow you a warm coat," Jim told Bruno. He was convinced, as all northern trappers are, that rabbit fur makes a dog's hair come in thicker. The last trap he visited that night held a prize that made up for many fruitless days. It was a slim black fisher, a female, smaller but more valuable than any male because of her finer fur. Jim gloated over the luxurious sheen of the dark pelt and took exceptional pains with the skinning. Next morning he led the team across the clean white expanse of the lake and struck overland to a chain of small ponds that lay to the east. High and dry poplar ridges made it pleasant country. Good fur country, too, if the maze of rabbit tracks meant anything. He built a half-dozen cubbies and set traps in them before returning to the lean-to at sunset. The following day would be the last of November, if he was reckoning right. 2 weeks since he had seen a white man. A homesickness for human companionship took hold of him, and he decided to start to meet Lindsay in the morning. In his eagerness he awoke while the night was still pitch black and made a quick breakfast and routed out the dogs. He might have had to go all the way to the head of the Squaw Lake before he encountered his brother, and this time of year there was only a scant 6 hours of daylight. Then he started packing the sled, realizing with some disappointment that he would have to go back to his home camp first. The fisher skin was not yet dry, and the dog pail was empty of meal. Grumblingly, he headed the team northward. Even the 2 ermine and the mink that he found in his traps along the lines were scant recompense for the loss of a day. It was nearing noon when they drew close to the squaw. Old Bruno lifted his nose and gave a joyful whine and flung his weight into the collar. There was a sharp, inquiring bark from across the river, answered at once by yelps from Jim's team. Smoke was coming up from the cabin stovepipe. Lumbering into a run, the boy crossed the ice ahead of the dogs and climbed the bank with a whoop. Lindsay's blond head appeared suddenly in the doorway. "Hi!" grinned the younger brother. "Where you been? I came down last night wanting to visit a little. Nobody here, so I made myself right at home." "It's a lucky thing I had this fisher skin," Jim laughed. "If it hadn't been for bringing it back here, I'd be mushing up to Squaw Lake by now. Got a sort of a hankering to see you last night. Gosh knows why. How you been, you stick in the mud?" They chained the dogs and went into the warm cabin. Lindsay had a pan of hash sizzling on the stove and was preparing to make cocoa. "Nothing like being free with the supplies when you're at another man's camp," he chuckled. "Come up my way sometime and I'll have to pay you back." It was good to sprawl by the stove and chat steadily while they ate. Each tried to recount every happening for the past 2 weeks, and they talked till their throats were sore from unaccustomed use. "We sound like a bunch of old Gorbies," Jim grinned at length, "but it sure is fun to have someone to gab to. Let's play cards. You bring the old pack along?" Lindsay went to get the playing cards out of his possible sack and paused as he reached the dark corner of the room. "Say," he remarked, pointing to the floor, "what's the idea of laying out your meat like this?" "Meat?" Jim asked puzzlingly. "What meat?" "Mice, 3 of them. laughed Lindsay. "Don't tell me you didn't put him there." The older boy went over to join him. "Well, I be a son of a gun," he muttered. The little bodies lay in a neat row between the grub box and the wall, each with a red puncture in his throat. Jim scratched his head. "I guess that weasel must have adopted me," he grinned. "Better'n a watchdog any day, and he sure's been working overtime since I have left."